remembered my visit in February when I was at your university. Fantastic job. I'm really happy that you established this center in migration and global studies and interconnected journal. Fantastic.
Well, we'd like to thank you because it is your coming that gave us an idea that we need to establish a center for, global issues, migration issues, and so on. To be frank with you, we would not have created this center if you didn't come to NOUN. It is when you came and you made your presentation that we said, oh, this is wonderful. So let's do it. And there you are. We're very happy with it. Very, very happy.
Very much looking forward to our cooperation with
That's
me,
okay.
and I will join my colleagues to help to contribute by their work as well.
All right, no problem. So you're welcome.
Thank you very much, and I think I will stop sharing my slide so that we can start formally, and then allow Professor Rubek to share his PowerPoint after my brief introduction. Good morning, everyone. Well, I will break the rule that I've been seriously, and the VC will pardon me for this, Mr. Vice Chancellor Sir, Professor Emeritus Sogolo, my colleagues, and of course the presenter, who is also a professorial fellow of the Center of Excellence in Migration and Global Studies. Is actually today giving us the third professorial fellow of this center, which is primarily a research and also a mentoring opportunity for the early scholars. And present with us, we have so many other, associate fellows, senior fellows, and the previous professorial fellow. Today we have in our midst a member. I'm so delighted, and I started recording the moment the Vice Chancellor told me something that I didn't even know today. He told us about the fact that this center, was birthed because of the visit of Professor Marek to NOUN, NOUN, and there is brilliant presentation as, for him to have said that, it must have been a brilliant presentation. Trust me, Prof, because Professor Abdallah Adamu is a rare breed. It's not easy being a professor of two disciplines and justifiably presenting and mentoring many of us. So we are so delighted to know that part of our history, and then the opportunity for us to do the day-to-day running of that center that he has in his vision, giving us that. He never called me to say you have to do this, do that. No, it's very rare. And I'm telling you, having been in the university system for 32 years, that I know what I'm talking about, and I know how some vice chancellors or leaders will just tell you you have to do it this way or not. So we thank him again for this vision, and then we thank you for coming and also in kind of imparting our visit to start this. Having said that, Professor Merrick, as I stated, is a professorial fellow of our center, but more than that, he is a distinguished professor and the director of Center of Global Studies, Institute of Philosophy, the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague, Czech Republic. I keep saying Czechoslovakia, so he corrected me, and we all made errors, so I have to repost and repost. And I thank him for reminding me. It's just like I remember serving in what used to be Gongola State in northern part of Nigeria. And my MAMSA, MAMSA is a mass mobilization, which was my second assignment, apart from teaching at the College of Education then. And I was calling everybody Hausa, And the man sat me down and said, "Where did you learn your history?" I said, "I read this groundwork of history." He said, "No, I'm not Hausa. I'm a Mumuye." I said, "What? Mumuye?" So to cut a long story short, I have to research, ethnographic research, and I wrote the history of Jalingo, which earned me a state award for the NYSC in 1988. But having said that, we have in our midst somebody that is well cited globally. As at date, you have 230 scholars citing Professor Marek Rubek's works, that republic. Today, he will be speaking to us about a topic that is both philosophical yet impactful, that I believe our most senior person in the house, Professor Emeritus Sogolo, would be so delighted, as well as the Deputy Vice Chancellor Academies. I believe he's joining us, or he has joined, because these are philosophers also. But more importantly, telling the narrative from a different perspective, but more importantly, if I can say that again, in a way that it shows a multidisciplinary nature of this center, of migration itself, so that when you see or hear migration, we are not just talking about people within X field or discipline. It's about all of us. And that has been the motive of this center. So without wasting much time, I present to you Professor Marek Rubek, the third Professorial Fellow of Center of Excellence in Migration and Global Studies, to deliver his lecture. Prof, you have 45 minutes or 50 to deliver. We are to listen and learn, but at the end of the day, we will have 1 or 2, 3, 4 comments or questions. On behalf of the center and the university, I thank you so much for honoring us. Thank you, sir. You are welcome to present.
Your Excellency, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank organizers of this Professorial Fellow Lecture Series, mainly Professor Tijani, Director of the Center at NOUN. And again, I would like to congratulate you to an establishment of the center. It's a wonderful job, and I believe it will have a great influence, and it will help to develop a cooperation with many colleagues globally. In my lecture, I will focus on global dialogue of cultures, especially on migrating culture patterns from a philosophical perspective. I will approach this topic from a philosophical perspective, especially within an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary global studies, focusing on culture and civilizational analysis. Let me please share my PowerPoint presentation. The aim of my lecture is dealing with philosophical analysis of migrating cultural patterns in order to articulate a global dialogue of cultures, mainly in relation to sub-Saharan Africa. It analyzes the potential for consensus among cultures by means of intercultural dialogue. It is a contribution towards overcoming the confrontation among cultural patterns, among cultures or civilizations, also countries and so on, and the eradication of the coercive imposing of interests and values onto other cultures and civilizations. It focuses on Africa's interactions with various cultures, the specific cultural patterns of the influential macro regions of the world. It shows migrating cultural patterns across the world and their partial overlapping consensus. The lecture demonstrates that an intercultural identification and satisfaction of common needs and interests across individual cultures that recognize each other is one of the effective forms of resistance against people being misrecognized. However, this requires a formulation of common needs and interests, and also values, based on the needs and interests of individual cultures, of the specific macro-regions and the dialogue among them. The interpretation of my paper, of this lecture, is a contribution to create unity in plurality. It means the universality of needs and interests within the plurality of respective cultures in the world. Let's see a connection with Africa. Concerning African cultures, the relevance of Africa has recently grown in the world. Africans have the potential for advancement according to their own kinds of recognition and needs and interests. And they are developing mutual relations with their partners from other parts of the world. The role of African countries and the African Union in the world has increased mainly in economic and political terms. BRICS countries and several other countries, including Nigeria, which have been on an economic upswing within a plurality of various modern patterns over recent decades, have been influential in the development of African countries in the multilateral context, in the South-South cooperation, as well as in relation to Western countries. There are mutual interactions of migrating cultural patterns there. The major Western powers have been aware of these relevant trends and have already partly recommended and reformulated and intensified their relations with African countries as well. The content of this lecture is as follows. The lecture focuses on the mentioned issues from the local to larger, regional, continental, and global levels, in line with traditional and modern African culture approaches, and also in the cooperation of these approaches with other cultures, if and when the latter enlarge their perspectives by opening up a global polylateral point of view. So I will discuss the following aspects. First, the topic of conflict and dialogue. Second, I will focus in a critical hermeneutic way on the intercultural and intercivilizational nature of this conflict and consensus, of course. Third, I will concentrate on the specification of my idea by analyzing the African interactions with other countries and macro-regions of the world, which have different cultures, including their economic aspects, international relations, and other global interactions. Many times, researchers, politicians, and other people, focus only on economy or on politics. But I think we have to offer a broader, complex view of cultures. And then we will see also their aspects, economic aspects, international relations, and so on. Finally, I will conclude my lecture by focusing on migrating cultural patterns by stressing a mutual respect among different cultures, countries, and so on, and transcultural consensus. Let's see first an issue of conflict and dialogue. There are frequent intercultural conflicts in the present global situation, which is characteristic of an increasing number of interactions of people from different cultures, from the fields of economic, communication, or other types of cultural interaction. This is not always mean a state of war. Conflicts take on diverse forms, from the cultivated to aggressive ones. Although the confrontation of cultures leads towards the polarization and culmination of the conflict. The intercultural dialogue among cultures attempts to contribute to their mutual recognition and consensus. These forms of conflict resolution didn't develop as separate entities, but stem from the development of mutual relations between people and their requirements for their resolution. The process of misrecognition of certain groups of populations in the long-term historical perspective causes their justified dissatisfaction and articulation of their claims for recognition. At the same time, sometimes of misrecognition might be initiated by artificial conflicts, which are invoked for the purpose of the legitimization of particular power structures or for the purpose of unjust economic and other interests. Despite the fact that some confrontations between cultures are fictional because they are forced upon people without any significant connection with the reality, a possibility of self-fulfilling prophecy has at least a partial influence on the transformation of these conflicts into serious and real confrontations. The example may be the conflict between the West and various others. The relationships between people are then formed as a complex of real and fictional conflicts. People react critically, of course, to the disadvantages and other forms of oppression which they face, and in this way they map the individual problems that need to be resolved. In the background of their experienced reality in Africa and elsewhere, they notice also positive fragments of reality and try to develop them. In a relatively favorable environment, the criticism of current forms of misrecognition in the world and attempts to correct them may be realized in the form of a cultivated intercultural dialogue, which is based also on deep philosophical analysis of intercultural dialogue. The notion of conflict then includes the notion of consensus, which may assist direction towards desired final state. And it contains various aspects, not only philosophical analysis and dialogue, but also interreligious and inter-economic, interpolitical dialogues. The intercultural dialogue attempts to identify the current social norms through critical discussion and create new ones that might be shared by individual cultures in a universal way. Because the communication doesn't often concern only two cultures, and therefore a dialogue in the literal sense, it is more precise to talk of a polylogue. Such a broad concept of the discourse cannot in the least supplement the solutions to all the social, economic, political, and other related problems. What can be done is, nevertheless, to provide conditions for an important intercultural framework for working on these problems. Let's see the issue of universal and particular. The discourse, which is the subject of my analysis, contains two fundamental elements. The first one relates to the formation of a dialogue from below, from the perspective of various cultures and their relationship within human civilization. The second element is in the form of universal common needs and interests, which may be the outcome of this type of dialogue in order to solve important universal problems such as a global economic crisis and an environmental crisis with the climate change, etc. This kind of approach, which is gradually formulated and subjected to many comments on migrating culture patterns of individual cultures, could be the unifying and universal element. In short, the objective is to reach a commonly shared transcultural consensus through intercultural means in order to develop and replace the current supranational repressive situation, which is not universally accepted because it includes non-universal patterns. It's related to the second point of my lecture, and it is about cultures and civilizations. So let's see what it means in detail. What does it mean to talk about the dialogue which is supposed to be intercultural? The adjective may be initially read as an umbrella term which covers the relationship among individual cultures or civilizations. This definition raises the question about the relationship between the word culture and the word civilization. The preliminary answer might be to define them as synonymous, but under the conditions that the limits and any possible misunderstandings are clarified before using these terms. Their frequent interchanging is not only the case in the Western languages. For example, there is also the Arabic word umran, which has a prominent place already in the teaching of Ibn Khaldun, which is a scholar from the 14th century. And it can be translated either as civilization or as culture. The word civilization is not used in one sense only. On the one hand, it is designated to the whole human civilization in the entire humanity, while on the other hand, it's designated to just one of the civilization or cultural circles within their specific cultural patterns. It is used, for example, in relation to the civilization or culture of the West, the Confucian world in Asia, China, and around, the Islam, and of course the African culture and civilization, or rather African cultures in plural. There is a problem with so-called pseudo-universalism. It is more often the case of colonialist point of view, whether reflected or not, which under the heading of civilization promotes one culture with its cultural patterns over another, and we know it from the history. The history of colonialism and the forms of colonialism which were legitimized by European universalism, or more precisely by pseudo-universalism, false, fake universalism, are its unfortunate consequences. The meta-theoretical viewpoints commit the same transgression, which, without the contribution of other cultures and from the viewpoint of one culture, attempt to dictate which social concepts and cultural constructs, values, and so on are relevant and eventually should be considered as universal, but in reality pseudo-universal. Let's see cultural subjects of dialogue, intercultural dialogue precisely. The conception of cultures in the intercultural and transcultural dialogue also requires a more exact identification of the cultural subjects of dialogue. Who is talking? In relation to Lawrence Bloom, for example, the several categories can be distinguished, although none of which have to be designated definitely and can transform in time. So first category of the subject is not in the center of attention in the intercultural dialogue too much, because the dialogue is primarily focused on relations between larger cultural units than individuals. So the first is an individual person who can be part of a particular culture, and of course individuals can develop an intercultural dialogue, but because they are individuals, they are parts of the broader cultural groups which make communication between cultures. So they are important, individuals are important, but at the same time, they are part of the broader cultural community. The relationships at the individual level are certainly important, although in the conflict of entire cultures, millions of individual persons don't enter into discussion, only, let's say, intellectuals, politicians, and other representatives. But individuals can promote their individuals and group interests, of course. This opened the question of multicultural dialogue within the intracultural framework between the majority and minorities also. Secondly, we may discuss a group of individuals specified by particular culture or group with particular cultural identity. This is a category which is formed by culturally formed groups of individuals. They include, in a more restricted sense, various cultural groups in a nation state or the majority of the population. And in a broader sense, the majority of the entire population in Europe, for example, or in other parts of the world. It can be the population of the European Union, the African Union, or a smaller unit in the sub-Saharan Africa, the USA, or other countries which have similar specified culture, economic, and political systems. A similar type of discussion could be initiated in relation to, let's say, various minorities in France or in the European Union in general. Although this is not a general rule, these minorities are often culture related to the majority of another country. For example, the Turkish minority in Germany is culturally related to the majority in Turkey, for example, or a Nigerian minority in the UK is culture related to Nigeria. Minorities and majorities, of course, cannot be considered as fixed, and the ratio between the minority and the majority may significantly transform in time. The third category, we can analyze the entire culture with its cultural patterns, including many aspects, economic, political, social ones, etc. We can say it's also a civilization in some cases. It includes the creations of culturally defined groups, from artworks to various social customs, and finally to the whole life in the society, which is a collection of various social, political, legal, and other entities, including subjects, of course. In the wider context and from the long-term perspective, it is also possible to add population to these creations, which may be considered as a cultural product of itself. Population as it stands does not perceive itself as an object, but asserts itself primarily as a creating subject, which gradually forms culture, customs, rules, and objects in interaction with the related environment. Now, let's move to the third part of my lecture. Let's focus on Africa's foreign interactions. After explaining the issue of intercultural dialogue, now I real issue, namely the interaction of African countries and Africa with countries and macro-regions in other parts of the world. The former colonial powers still hold influence on African countries, although they no longer pursue a colonial kind of relationship, fortunately. These are mainly Western European countries that dominate the European Union's policy. Furthermore, they are USA as a key Western country, etc. The last 2 decades are the most important period for the contemporary stage of interactions between Africa and Europe, mainly the European Union. So let's see various macro regions of the world and their relations to Africa and how it develops. And I would like to stress some problematic parts, but also hopeful parts. The European Union, since 2000, there were summits of heads of state and governments. They have been organized at the level of the European Union and the African Union, previously the Organization of African Union. Although inter-regional and inter-macro-regional cooperation took place in some form before. The first Intercontinental Africa-Europe Summit was held in Cairo, in Egypt in 2000, organized by the EU and OAU, and they tried to overcome some colonial and post-colonial problems which were there in the past, and also other problems. And I hope that Africa will develop and it will get positive issues as autonomous and sovereign continent. The important is the joint Africa-EU strategy, which is a platform for relations of African and EU countries, and it includes migrating cultural patterns on both sides and creates an overlapping consensus on some of these patterns. So it's important to see what European countries want, what African countries want, and they can try to create a consensus on cooperation. It was approved in the summit in Lisbon in 2007, and it is supported by individual African and EU states, the EU and the African Union as well. The Cairo Declaration and its action plan for the coming years were adopted with the vision to create new strategic relations. The Africa-EU partnership, the other EU-Africa summits followed, as I said, 2007, but also 2010, 14, and 17. And it continued later as well with the new topics. And the main theme of the last summit was focused also on youth, and it reflects a strong demographic change Africa has faced. This topic is currently being elaborated and is emphasized in individual joint activities. Summits are held every 3 years, and usually declarations and action plans or roadmaps are adopted. In addition to these summits, at the highest political level, there are regular ministerial and commission meetings, and the dialogue is going on this year as well. There is the important joint EU-Africa strategy, which is a platform for relations of African and EU countries. Let's move to another important country, which is a macro region itself. As for other Western countries, the essential role is kept by the USA, which has a strong influence over the African continent, sometimes in positive, sometimes in negative senses. In the period after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, the loss of interest in African countries prevailed, partly in the US. There was a growing era in which it was automatically assumed that the USA was unilaterally determining global developments, and that there was no need for any further specification of this approach. The situation changed after September 11, 2001. The securitization approach in the war on terror has begun to be applied to African countries. Africa was perceived by the USA administration as a partly Islamic territory near the Middle East and as a terrorist threat to the US after 9/11. But of course, we should stress also positive aspects of African countries and so on, which was not done at the time, and it's but there are many other important macro regions of the world, mainly in the BRICS countries, the most influential ones these years. First, we can mention India, which had the big influence, especially in the east coast of Africa in the past. As for the relationship among African and other developing countries, the revitalization of interest in African countries was linked to the multilateral period of the BRICS formation. India, as a member of this group, initiated the first India-Africa Forum Summit. Summits held with heads of states and governments approximately once every 3 years, as official international meetings are held alternatively in India and Africa. The first took place in New Delhi in 2008, the second in Addis Ababa in 2011, and the third and fourth again in New Delhi 2015, respectively in 2018. They provide incentives for cooperation of the whole cultures in the fields of politics, trade, investment, education, medicine, development aid, etc. Both India and Africa each have approximately 40% of the global poor. So understandably, they focus on development and eradication of poverty. Another major power, Russia. Further cooperation of African countries is with Russia. While after the World War II in the post-colonial period, the Soviet Union had a number of strongly developed relations with African countries that experimented with socialism. After the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, these relations cooled. The Soviet Union disintegrated and its successor Russia had many problems with itself in the 1990s. After the subsequent consolidation of the situation in Russia, approximately since 2000, mainly the emergent BRICS multilateralism and the subsequent imposition of the USA and European sanctions against Russia after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 led Russia to sought new outlets in Africa again. And since then, Russia develops much bigger cooperation with African countries. The Arab culture, another important part of the world. Historically, the influence of Arabic traders and hence the Arab culture, including the economy, the Islamic religion and language, was very important for Africa, not only for East Africa. Indeed, the development of Swahili, the Swahili language, Swahili culture on the east coast of Africa and its related regions is an eloquent example. Trade and more generally interaction with the Arab world continues to this day, including the influence of Islam in the areas of religion, culture, or politics. However, this influence is less institutionalized. It requires a different kind of analysis than I use in this text when I focus on the institutional interactions of Africa and the outside world. As for Latin America, especially Brazil is important. Interactions between Africa and Latin America, in particular Brazil, have become an increasingly important reference point in recent decades as well. The common fates of people during a period of historical injustice linked the slave trade between Africa and Latin America. The import of slaves to Brazil and other countries, mainly from West Africa, was one of the most brutal stages of human history established by the Europeans. These repressions didn't remain unresponsive and faced persistent resistance and brave anti-slavery struggles with many rebellions, such as those made by quilombos, the Brazilian settlements of escaped slaves. At the same time, this historical reflection was a recent opportunity for greater cooperation between Brazil and African countries in the framework of South-South cooperation during the last 20 years. China, another important macro-region and the country, and the culture, and the civilization as well. China is the country that has had the new most intensive relations with African countries recently. with its strong economic development and various social programs that help meet the basic social and other needs of Chinese citizens. China is an inspiration to follow for many African countries and to partner for cooperation for all of them. Since around 2000, we may say that a new era of China-Africa cooperation started. China, the world's largest developing country, is active in developing cooperation with other developing regions of the world. It seeks for better relations than Western countries pursued in the colonial era and also in the contemporary global system since the beginning of the 90s many times. It is apparent also that in the China-Africa cooperation, China and Africa together account for almost about 2.7 billion people. It's about the third of all the planet's inhabitants. And China, with its specific model, lifted 800 million people from poverty during the last 40 years. It's the highest number in the human history for such a short time. There is the new Silk Road and POCAC. The cooperation between China and Africa has recently deepened, especially under the new Silk Road. As the Belt and Road Initiative over the past years since 2013, when it was established. The long-term platform for developing relations with these two macro regions of the world is also the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which have helped developing Belt and Road as well. There are important elements of interactions. First of all, non-interference. It's important for independent development of individual countries, cultures, and civilizations. Now there is a relevant concept of non-interference, which includes 5 no's. The new concept of non-interference consists of these 5 neutral interlinked parts. So the first no is no non-interference in the promotion of development ways that are suitable for the conditions of African countries. Second, non-interference in the internal affairs of African countries. Third, non-imposition of foreign will on African countries. Fourth, non-attachment of political constraints to help Africa. And fifth, not striving for selfish profits in investment and financing in Africa. So if it's fulfilled, Africa and African countries can develop in an independent way and to get profit from its own resources and to be richer and with a higher quality of living standards. Win-win cooperation. It's a following concept which is related with the previous one, and it has 4 no one can. No one can undermine the connection between people in Africa and other partners. No one can hold back Africa from their renewal. No one can deny the success of African cooperation, and no one can prevent international efforts to support the development in Africa. So it makes possible a higher standards of living in Africa. And the last part of my lecture is connected to the 4th part, to the topic towards Africa's engagement in the global dialogue of culture from regional conditions. It should be seen that the agents are not only individuals, as I mentioned, or social groups and African countries, but also the entire African regions or macro regions, both in terms of their internal development and in terms of their foreign interactions. They have been already existing regional communities, mostly economic and political ones, but not only, they include also cultural aspects and other aspects. Arab Maghreb Union, Community of Saharan States, Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, which is important for Nigeria. Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, East African Community, Southern African Development Community, Economic Community of Central African States, including the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, etc. There are also Pan-African tendencies. Africa as the whole continent is a relevant macro-region. There have been integrational Pan-Africanist tendencies which established the Organization of African Unity and later the African Union. Projects in the African Union are supported by the African Development Bank and other institutions. 50 years after the important year 1963, when 32 African newly independent countries signed the Organization of African Unity and new agenda inspired by redefined Pan-Africanism came into existence, so-called Africa 2063. The idea is to achieve a significant development on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of this year of African independence. And it's done in close cooperation with the United Nations, for example, with its development aims. Now I would like to make a conclusion on migrating cultural patterns and to say something on the worth respect of individual cultures and global transcultural consensus. Multiple economic, political, and other interactions of African countries and regions, as well as Africa as a whole, with other macro regions of the world, with the migrating cultural patterns represented by the European Union, the USA, China, Russia, India, and others, is a specification and application of the idea of intercultural dialogue. It is not only about the encounters of migrating economic or political patterns, but includes the whole spectrum of needs, interests, and values expressed in the complex cultural patterns. It is why it creates not only consensus, but often also conflicts, because individual countries and cultures and civilizations try to offer their own vision of needs, interests, and values, and others as well. So we see their migrating cultural patterns among cultures, and they discuss among themselves. They try to reach a consensus, and that's how cultural patterns migrate from one culture to another culture. And there are some overlaps. Sometimes there are not, and it should be respected. In continuity with the explanation I offered above, it is possible to say that the connecting element between the macro-regional cultures, which are primarily tied to culturally defined groups of individuals, and the civilization in terms of the entire humanity, is the intercultural dialogue. The significant feature of the intercultural dialogue is the effort to find first a mutual respect among dialogical partners, and second, a certain transcultural feature in common, which might be shared by some cultures. And I mean by two cultures, for example, the African Union, European Union, or two individual countries. And in some cases, also all cultures, and therefore by the entire human civilization on the planet. The effort to agree on certain commonly shared fundamental norms makes international interest and norms a significant topic. These overlapping and universally shared categories may be considered as cultural constructs, which follow on from similar approaches to similar problems, which are encountered by various cultures. They could also be cultural universals if we use the terms of quasi-derived. Whatever the basis of this is, there are long-term circumstances for culturally created consensus between cultures in various macro regions, and also universals on a global scale, due to the fact that none of the larger cultural circles are isolated and they don't influence each other. This fact is not an evidence of a kind of shared unity. Nevertheless, it is a testimony of at least an awareness of common problems which can't be ignored. They must be discussed, and we can try to find common solutions. One of these outcomes is the level of consensus of the humanity in regard to an elimination of wars, an elimination of poverty, higher standards of living, the solution of climate change and other environmental problems, the global financial speculations which caused the 2008 global financial and economic crisis, or the pandemic health crisis. These are the problems of the humanity, and we can try to solve them together. In the end, I would like to thank you again for an invitation, for your attention, and I wish you good luck in the development of the new center at the National Open University of Nigeria. And I hope that we will develop this cooperation together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Rubek, for that brilliant presentation. Of course, it is a professorial presentation, and we see people clapping for you, including Professor Emeritus Sogolo. We really appreciate you. I've been able to identify 6 people that have shown interest to ask questions or make comments. The person with the name Journeys1, I think that person is using iPhone or something. I don't know your name. You introduce yourself. So I'm going to unmute as follows. Journeys1, you go first. Dr. Williams, I think Journeys is no longer with us. Dr. Williams, you go. I've asked you to unmute yourself. Professor Bewaji from the Caribbean islands, you go after. I've asked you to unmute yourself, sir. Professor Sogolo, kindly unmute yourself. And then Professor Abdallah Uba Adamu, please also unmute yourself. I've asked all of you to unmute. Whoever is ready can go. And if I still have more hands up, kindly chat with me or just raise your virtual hand. Okay, I have one, Joy Nwagu. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself also.
Thank you very much, bro.
Okay, so go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name,
30 seconds.
My name is Dr. William. Yeah, Dr. William is the name.
Okay.
Professor Hilbeck, thank you very much for this presentation. I want to thank you especially for your stand on transcultural consensus. But I'm worried about this framework and how possible it is for Africans, to integrate very well in this your position. My worry stems from the fact that before now we knew that Western civilization caused quite a lot of damage to the African culture and tradition. And thanks to the African scholars who had fought so hard to upturn some of these ills that was written about African traditions and culture. My worry is, in a global world today, going by the fact that we're having heads of states who are becoming extremists, who are becoming so nationalistic, how then, do we see them accepting this stand of transcultural consensus? Because for me, I see culture as a new trend by the West,
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I agree with you.
Prof, you take all the questions. I'm sorry I didn't tell you that.
Yeah.
We take all the questions or comment, and you respond. We close up.
Okay.
The next person can go ahead, please. I could see.
Yes, I think I'm second.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, sir. Professor Bewa.
Yes, I didn't even know you wanted me to speak because I didn't so indicate. But the only comment I have is with regard to this thing that refused to go away. The concept of Africa south of the Sahara, which I believe Professor Huberg would I believe he knows that it's a fabrication that was engineered for specific purposes, which I think we need to transcend. Historically, the Sahara Desert was never a desert. It was populated by human beings, and movement of people went from north to south, from east to west. It was a continuous continent. And the artifacts that are found there, which I discussed in my Black Aesthetics 2013, and which Diop and Zaslavsky have, incorporated in their research, shows very clearly what can be called a continent in which migrations of peoples, of economics, of ideas, and including the Mediterranean. Europe was never such a separated place from Africa because people moved, and when they talk about Mediterranean Europe, it's Black Europe, if you'll agree with me. I just wanted to make that point. Other comments that I have, I'll pass it on to Professor Ibikunle because those are more contentious and I think you might want to look at them differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The next person, please. Anyone can go out of those people that have on mute.
Okay. Let me make a few points. I want to, first of all, commend Professor Hubik for this, lecture. I'm particularly interested because it has connection with philosophy. More specifically, the subtitle, I saw something there from a philosophical perspective. And so I really was expecting, that emphasis on the perspectives. What is it that is philosophical about his analysis? It's a good analysis, quite all right. But I thought that he was going to emphasize those cultural universals that cut across all societies in terms of values, in terms of perception of humanity, those aspects that you find when Kant talked about the categorical imperatives, things that human beings hold in common. And I thought also that he was going to emphasize knowledge to the extent that your knowledge of these values also means that you endeavor to adhere to them. If that were emphasized, then you understand why leaders such as Trump will come out and then will gain support predominantly from the non-college Americans who maybe are not schooled about these cultural universals, and so do not share much about other cultures except theirs. And so education becomes very important in terms of this, dialogue you're talking about across cultures. Education is an important aspect. I thought those were areas were going to be emphasized when I saw from a philosophical perspective. And, I believe you can still look into some of those areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The next person is, it's going to be Professor Abdallah Ubadama.
Thank you very much, Professor Marek. Once more, thank you very much for that brilliant, uplifting paper, which is similar to the one that you also presented at NOUN some time ago. Mine is cultural, because I am into cultural studies, and I'm therefore very interested in the way these issues of transcultural issues affect our understanding of emergent societies. I think from what you presented, I have seen something that I call nation within a nation, where you have people who are moving, who are moved from one nation to another, and when they move to another nation, they create another miniature nation. And that brings about the issue of integration that I've always been talking about when it comes to global immigration. How come is it that when we go a nation within a nation, we don't really integrate with the dominant nation that we find ourselves in, and we still maintain a nation within ourselves? Why do we have little China in San Francisco? Why do we have little China in England? Why do we have Chinatown? I mean, all these places of nation within a nation, therefore creates a philosophical understanding of what is integration, what is society. We need to reconfigure the conception of our conception of what society is. So is society our nation, or is a society a conglomeration of nations? And if we, as members of a particular nation, move to another nation, are we moving philosophically to integrate with the mindset of the recipient nation, or do we still remain nation within a nation? I mention this because you talk about Russia, you talk about China, but you did not talk about the Balkan states. I'm a northern Nigerian. In the 60s, the northern Nigerian government created a link with Russia and other Balkan states through what they call friendship societies. So what we have is a large number of northern Nigerians who have studied in Balkan areas, but particularly Bulgaria, Romania, and then to Russia. And when they came back not like a Russian food, not promoting Russian food or language or music, but with Russian ideology, state ideology. In other words, all the communists, the radicals we have, were those who were sponsored by these friendship societies that go over there. And when they come back, they import ideologies with them. So they have created another Russia in Nigeria. They have created another Romania and Bulgaria in Nigeria. So it is this dialogue, this issue of disruption of nation within a nation. When you get out of Africa and go to another place, I want you to see how you can address that nation within nation. This is because in Germany, the biggest problem now is nation within a nation was Turks. The Turks who have immigrated to Germany have maintained nation within a nation, and they refuse to integrate. So if we are maintaining nation within a nation, then what is the future of transcultural exchange as well as transcultural uniformity? Because I don't see the rationale of Chinatown in San Francisco, right in the middle of San Francisco. I don't see the rationale of Chinatown. If you are in San Francisco, and you should live and think like an American. But if you say, I have my identity, I am not going to give up my identity, then who asked you to come to the US? US is created as a result of a merger of identities. So the whole idea of being in the United States or in UK or in Romania looking for an African food is anachronistic. It doesn't make sense. If I'm in Bulgaria, I eat Bulgarian food. If I'm in St. Petersburg, I eat food made by Russian. I don't have to start looking for African food or Nigerian food. So if nation within nation is a contradictory concept in global migration, what happens to my identity? Does that mean that once I move to another nation, I divest myself of my identity, cultural identity, political identity, and so on? Or if I receive other people from other countries, do I accept their ideology, just like the Chinese are now doing in Nigeria, and the Chinese have done in East Africa? In fact, at one stage in Ethiopian Airlines, the instruction given by the pilot were in Chinese. I have heard that. I was riding in the Ethiopian airline aircraft and moving along East African coast from Ethiopia to Addis Ababa, and it was in Chinese. I mean, this guy was talking in Chinese. He talked in Swahili, he talked in English, and then he talked in Chinese. So what are we saying here? Are we saying a new wave of post-colonialism? And I don't use the word post-colonialism as a single word, but separated post-colonialism or neo-colonialism, or what I even prefer, hyper-colonialism, in which a nation within a nation submerges an identity of another. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Adam. And let me crown it by posing this question to you, sir, Professor Rubek. How do we contextualize migrating cultural patterns? Because in a simple and a simplistic way of understanding your paper, I noticed somewhere, migrating cultural patterns. How exactly do we contextualize it? How can we, based on the last speakers and those before? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much for your deep questions, commentaries, and reflections. May I answer now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I will go step by step as the questions were raised. The first one by Dr. William. How to make a transcultural consensus in an era of nationalistic or neo-colonialistic approaches. Yes, it's a big challenge, but exactly because of these problems, I think that we have to try to develop a dialogue, and there are many attempts to make it already in individual countries, including Africa, in the United Nations and elsewhere. Because if the conflicts and these nationalistic tendencies were not here, there would be no need to make a better intercultural dialogue. Of course, it's pretty hard to make it, but if we don't try to do it, I mean, philosophers, other experts in the humanities, in the social sciences, politicians, representatives, diplomats, then there would be more and more conflicts. And I think that it's important to open these questions. Sometimes the topic is reduced only on an economic profit, but it's not enough, because sometimes it seems to be only an economic exchange or let's say political exchange, but it includes, as we talk about that, many culture and civilization patterns which are behind and many times are not addressed. But we know that these problems are here, so we have to analyze culture in details, philosophical aspect, sociological aspect, political science aspects, linguistic issues of language. Professor Adamu gave a wonderful lecture on migrating words and terms. So we can see that this is important for an analysis, and then we can see these migrating culture patterns, how they meet and how they can create some transcultural consensus, let's say, between individual two countries or between the whole cultures and so on. So I address that in the general way now, but in other answers, I will try to be deeper. Second question, an issue of Africa, south of Sahara, as a fabrication. Well, Yes, you are right. It's a construct which should be overcome. I mentioned that because when sometimes an analysis is done on Africa in general, some people require a specific analysis of this of the Arabic Africa in the north, which is a separated analysis, focusing only on the Arab culture and the Islamic world in connection with the Middle East and so on. Of course, it's a bit plural. It's not only the Arabic culture in the north of Sahara, but mainly the analysis requires this Arabic culture. While when we say we will focus on sub-Saharan Africa, it includes much more plural work, because of course there are more cultures mixing various influences and so on. And because I didn't want to focus only on sub-Saharan Africa, you saw that in my lecture, I focused also on Pan-African tendencies, on the African Union and so on. And I tried to offer a broader perspective by focusing on Africa as a whole. And I said that Africa has its own cultures or culture and civilizations, and also a civilization. So I said only that I focus especially on sub-Saharan countries because I didn't offer the specific analysis of the Arabic culture. This was the only reason I mentioned that, but you saw that I really offered the broader picture of Africa, African Union and Pan-African tendencies and so on. And you are right that it's important to analyze also the Mediterranean region in the past and now, which was a common region between Africa and Europe. And it's also a separated culture or civilization entity, which we can analyze. So yes, I agree. Now, the question number 3, on a philosophical perspective of my lecture. Yes, I mentioned some philosophers, Quasi-Beredo, Naim, and others, African philosophers, but I tried to develop it also in other humanities and the social sciences in order to offer broader interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary analysis, which has its basis in, let's say, cultural philosophy, political philosophy, economic philosophy, social philosophy, moral philosophy, but it goes on. And I agree it would be important to enlarge my analysis by stressing an importance of knowledge and education. I will improve my lecture and my paper when I deliver it in a written form. Lecture number 4 by Vice Chancellor. Yes, it's a very complicated and probably the deepest question we have to deal with, a nation within a nation, and how to solve these issues. First, I didn't mention the Balkan countries because now, the last 20, 30 years, they are not an important influential macro region of the world. Of course, I would analyze it if I had more time. There are more macro regions of the world which are important, like Central Asia, like with countries Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and others, these Muslim countries, or the Balkans, or Central America, for example. But because I try to focus, let's say, on Latin America, I chose Brazil as the biggest Latin American state with 200 million people, like Nigeria. So I had to reduce a bit my analysis. But your question dealing with the Balkans is in fact interconnected with the issue of Russia and the Soviet Union. So I partly mentioned that Russia and surrounding countries lost its own influence in the 1990s, but then Russia started rise again, and now it's important country in the world again. But as for your specific question, I think that even if it requires a deeper analysis, I would say this. While in February, when I was at your university, I was focusing more on the periods of time, focusing on the specific periods of, let's say, colonialism, post-colonialism, and other periods. And I dealt a little with other countries. Now I didn't focus in my lecture today on the specific periods of time, but I stress how these macro regions of the world today can deal with each other as specific cultures and how they can find a transcultural consensus in order to avoid conflicts. And when we see that there are countries, a nation within a nation or culture within a culture, I would say that in the past, there were these Italy, little China or Chinatown created. And sometimes it's still today developed, but it's more and more plural and transcultural, I would say, because before the main, let's say, the main wave of globalization since the beginning of the 1990s, countries were more separated, and when people migrated, they tend to create separated towns, like when colonizing the Americas, the Germans, the British, the French, Polish, and so on, they created their little national towns since, over many centuries. The last
Sorry, Prof, we have 1 minute.
Okay, 100 years.
Time, yeah.
Yeah. But now, when we live in a global times, I would say that people should integrate in their new countries, but at the same time, maybe they can keep their second identity via the global media, global communication, emails, and in the future, probably there will be periods of, let's say, or bigger and less integration, but when we will probably not cancel airplanes or email or internet and so on. So even if it can happen that some periods of time can be disintegrated in the future, then a bigger integration will come probably in the future. So it's a complex idea of local global interactions, and I would be happy to discuss that in detail. And the last question was your question, Professor Tijani, on how to contextualize cultural patterns. I think that we have a wonderful opportunity as philosophers and sociologists, economists, linguists, and so on, to contribute to an intercultural dialogue, to show what are interests of the people in Nigeria, in West Africa, in Africa in general, and to show these interests and needs and values in other parts of the world. And I would be happy to learn from you and talk about that in Europe and in other parts of the world when I give lectures, and to say what you want and need, and by doing that, to overcome the old conflicts and to fulfill Nigerian and African needs, interests, and values. Thank you very much for your attention and for your
Thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you, Professor Rubek, for that wonderful presentation and response. I would like to thank each and every one of you for, again, finding the time to join us for the last in the series, last Monday of November. We have one more, but it's going to be a roundtable. As soon as we finalize, we will let you know campus-wide and via WhatsApp group. We look forward to receiving Professor Rubik's Word formatted document, and we look forward to it being read by many globally. Thank you very much again. I wish each and every one of you a pleasant week ahead, and stay blessed. Say bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.